Good morning, and welcome to Community Teamwork's Fair Housing Program Training on Fair Housing. This is a brief introductory training on the basics of fair housing, and it is appropriate for tenants, housing providers like landlords or property managers, and anybody providing social services to clients that have housing problems. The work that provided the basis for this publication was supported by funding under a grant with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. The substance and findings of the work are dedicated to the public. The author and publisher are solely responsible for the accuracy of the statements and interpretations contained in this publication. Such interpretations do not necessarily reflect the views of the federal government. So, what is fair housing? Fair housing simply is housing without discrimination. And it works in a three-part test, really. First, you have a person that belongs to a protected class. Second, you have a harm or some sort of housing-related injury or unequal treatment that happens. And then third, that harm or unequal treatment is directly connected to somebody's membership in a protected class. So everybody belongs to protected classes. Everybody has a race they're identified with. Everybody has a country they were born in. Everybody has a gender or gender identification. Everybody has a religion. And I can say that because atheism is included for protection under this class. When you look at the world of classes protected in Massachusetts, this is what you see on the screen. The ones on the left are federal protections, and all of them are protected under Massachusetts state law. I want to point out that sex discrimination includes sexual orientation and gender identity under the federal laws now, and ancestry is also bound up in national origin discrimination. So if it's your parents or your grandparents that are from another country and a particular country and they're being discriminated against and you're being discriminated against by your association, you're included in national origin protections under federal law. So this is a very brief training. I have not prepared separate slides for each of these protected classes, but I am going to stay on this slide for a little while and talk about some of the more important ones to cover right now. The first four, race, color, national origin, and religion, those were the original protected classes included under the Fair Housing Act when it was passed in 1968. But I'd like to highlight with national origin discrimination, and this is important, is it includes everybody. It is not just US citizens. It is not just people that are legal permanent residents in this country. It is everybody, regardless of what your documentation status is. And I want to point this out because it is illegal for a housing provider to threaten to call ICE or report you in any other way for sticking up for your tenant rights or sticking up for your other fair housing rights. The federal government does not want housing providers to use the immigration and enforcement procedures of the government to commit housing discrimination. Sex discrimination. This one is worth noting that it includes sexual harassment. And when I say sex discrimination includes sexual harassment, really understand that all of these protected classes prohibit harassment based on that protected class status. It's just sexual harassment is a really pervasive form of harassment in housing and in employment and other areas. So a little extra attention here. Sexual harassment protections, they extend to folks under the Fair Housing Act and the Massachusetts Fair Housing laws. And for housing providers, if you are aware of one tenant harassing another tenant, or if you bring in an independent contractor and you are aware that they're harassing a tenant, take quick steps to address it, make it easy to report that kind of harassment, because ultimately you could end up on the hook if you don't take corrective measures. While we're on sexual harassment, for anybody receiving federal housing money, any housing providers that are receiving federal money, including housing subsidies, VAWA laws apply also. Protections for people that are survivors of domestic violence. And it could include breaking a lease or getting your locks changed or some other sorts of protections to make it easier to overcome the hurdles that people face when they are subjected to domestic violence. And those are often discussed in tandem with sexual harassment or sex discrimination. Family status discrimination really just means discrimination against families with children, particularly families with young children. And there's a lot of overlap here with lead laws and lead law protections. It's not okay for a family to be turned down housing because the provider is worried about having lead paint. So there's no, I don't rent to families with children under 6. You can't be turned away because you have a child under 6. There are other protections for families with young children too, like you can't be held to different noise standards or be unreasonably restricted in the way you use the place if you have children. Disability discrimination is one of the most reported forms of housing discrimination these days. I think over half of HUD's complaints right now are disability discrimination related. And overwhelmingly, these are failures to grant reasonable accommodations or modifications. Really unique to the disability protected class is a right to ask for an accommodation or modification to make it easier to use your housing if your impairment is preventing it because of like a policy that the provider has or the way the physical space is on the interior of your apartment or even some of the common space areas. A reasonable accommodation is really a change to a policy or procedure to make it easier for you to use and enjoy your housing, for an equal opportunity to use and enjoy your housing. We see this a lot for assistance animals, and we have a separate short training on assistance animals and a lot of materials on it. If there's a no pet policy and you have a service animal or an emotional support animal that you need to have in your apartment with you because it lives with you and it helps you, you are allowed to a exception to that no pet policy to have your animal there because it's not a pet, it is an assistance animal. It also is seen a lot with preferential parking spots. If you have a mobility impairment, you might need a close spot to your entrance when there's no otherwise assigned parking. It comes up with Social Security disability payments where your check might not come till the 5th and your rent's due on the 1st, so let's make it due on the 7th. There can be all sorts of different accommodations and modifications to the physical space that can be made. Under a Massachusetts specific protection, I'd like to highlight housing subsidy or public assistance. And this is really best described as source of income discrimination. It's a state protection, it's not a federal protection, but it says, listen, if you have a housing subsidy, if you have a Section 8 voucher or an MRVP voucher, or you're trying to participate in the RAFT program, your housing provider or your landlord or your property manager can't say, sorry, I'm not going to rent to you. I don't participate in that program. Or sorry, you missed a rent payment. I'm going to evict you and I'm not going to accept RAFT to overcome and accept those arrears. These are really the big strokes for protected classes. This is not enough to describe or give everybody all the information they know. This is really designed just as a short training. We have other materials on our website that talk a lot more about the variety of protected classes and the unique protections and hurdles that members in those groups are facing. You can register for our online trainings and learn more generally on our website or on HUD's website or at the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination. So who has to comply? And really everybody that touches housing services should be aware of fair housing laws and comply with housing laws. It includes landlords, it includes property managers, it's condo boards and HOAs. So, if you have a housing provider or if you are a small landlord and your building that you're renting out of has a condo board or homeowners association, you need to make sure that their policies and their practices and procedures are going to protect your tenants' fair housing rights. Local governments that administer housing programs would have to follow the laws. And if you're in a home buyer situation instead of a tenant situation, we also need to think about realtors, banks, mortgage lenders. All of these organizations need to comply with housing laws. Discrimination is thought about in several discrete ways because this is the way it's discussed in the Fair Housing Act, and it's also the way it's discussed in our Massachusetts state laws. Most of these that you're looking at are fairly self-explanatory. I would say denial of reasonable accommodations or modifications. This is probably the most technical area of fair housing law, and it's definitely worth a close look if you are a housing provider engaging in this process, or if you're a tenant that needs to ask for an accommodation. Before you do it or before you make decisions, review the rules, make sure everything's current, make sure your policies are up to date, and then go ahead and work through that accommodation process. The one that's probably least intuitive on this list is this idea of otherwise make unavailable. And I think of this really as doing two separate things. It's a catch-all around refusal to rent or sell. And it would include everything from saying, a housing provider saying, yes, I had this apartment listed, but it's not, I already rented it. It's not available anymore when it really is. It could be saying, oh, that apartment's gone, but let me show you this one in a different building that's available when that first unit is still available. It could be just like completely unreasonable delay in a application process. It could be like jump into somebody else on a list over someone else. There are a lot of ways to make it unavailable. It also covers evictions, and it can make property unavailable through like a discriminatory termination of a lease, because then that housing is no longer available. Refusal to rent or sell, different terms and conditions. Terms and conditions we can see a lot during a lease, where people are treated differently from other tenants because of their protected class status. It might be not getting a repair made. It might be denying a reasonable accommodation. It could just be like a different rent term. It could be a different application process. Somebody gets their credit check run and the other person doesn't. Threatening, intimidating, coercing. This can show up in source of income discrimination during an inspection process for Section 8. It can show up by asking for an accommodation. It can be the result of sexual harassment or reporting sexual harassment. There are a lot of different ways that people can end up in a situation where they are being intimidated or threatened based on their protected class status. So how do you get help? You can contact the Fair Housing Program. We can provide information and resources. We can provide technical assistance, helping you resolve your issues with your housing provider. If you're a housing provider, you can call us and you can say, I'm having a problem. What can I do to help resolve this? What can you do to help us resolve it? And we can provide assistance in that area. And we can refer folks to legal assistance or to enforcement with a HUD complaint or an MCAD complaint. We are not providing legal services at HUD. We're at the Fair Housing Program, but we can help get you to HUD. We can help get you to your legal services corporation that serves your area. We can help you fill out complaints and make sure that you're telling your story in a way that it's going to meet the checklist necessary to help you move your case along and get it investigated. To get in touch with us, you can do it three ways. You can fill out our online request for assistance, you can call us, and you can email us. We want to make it easy. And there's also a link up here if you want to just go directly and file a complaint with HUD. To learn more, you can visit us at our webpage. You can look at our resource library. We have tenant and housing provider listservs where we will send out a monthly email. We're not going to flood your inbox. It'll be a monthly email with different discrete topics of fair housing with some education materials and opportunities for trainings or other activities. And you can also sign up for our trainings online. Right now, we're offering 3 different types of trainings, one for general fair housing overview, one just on reasonable accommodations, and one on criminal records. Thank you. If you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch with us or a local fair housing helper in your area.